Tonight, we begin with a strike that Western intelligence agencies had feared for months, one that Russian analysts dismissed with confidence, and one that Ukrainian commanders quietly prepared with extreme precision. A strike that did not unfold over weeks or days, but in just a few intense hours. Hours that changed the direction of this war, hours that sent shockwaves from Washington to Beijing, hours that forced Vladimir Putin to face a reality he never believed he would confront. But what Ukraine carried out today crossed a boundary the entire world hoped would remain unbroken. And the moment that line was crossed, Russia reacted instantly. Their response was filled with fury, heavy threats, and a chilling promise that has placed the entire world on edge. Total annihilation. Those were the words coming from the Kremlin tonight. And for the first time since the beginning of this war, those words hold a weight that not NATO, not the Pentagon, and not even the Kremlin itself can fully predict. Gemdias, for several weeks, there were signals not from official Ukrainian military channels, not from Western governments, but subtle hints suggesting that Kyiv was preparing something unprecedented. Ukraine has always been aggressive, but also careful and calculated. Their strikes have followed a clear logic and almost a rhythm. Fuel depots, ammunition warehouses, command centers, air defense sites, targets designed to damage Russia's war machine, but without crossing the invisible lines that could drag this war into something far more dangerous. Plans, but what alarmed Western intelligence this week was that the rhythm suddenly went silent. Analysts who track Ukrainian drone activity recognized the signs immediately, the movement of long-range assets toward forward positions. A sudden increase in encrypted messages between Kyiv and special operations units. Reconnaissance drones appearing in air corridors that had been quiet for months, and a noticeable pause in publicly confirmed strikes. Everything became quiet, and whenever Ukraine becomes quiet, it means something very loud is about to happen. Bland inside Washington, intelligence officials issued warnings 3 days ago. They did not know what Ukraine was planning. They did not know when it would happen, but they did know one thing for certain: something was coming. Something big, something capable of changing everything. Banned early this morning, Russian air defense systems detected what they described as several unidentified aerial objects coming from the southwest, including drone signatures they had not seen for nearly a year and a half. These are the kinds of assets Ukraine only uses when they want to send a very specific message. A message to the Russian military, a message to Putin himself, or a message to the entire world. No one knew which message this was, or if it was all three at once. But everyone understood one thing clearly: Ukraine was changing its operational posture. And when a nation at war changes its posture without explanation, even by the slightest degree, every intelligence agency on the planet pays attention. The first signs came from Russian military bloggers, then from residents near Sochi, and then from satellite imagery analysts who noticed something that made their blood run cold. Smoke rising from a compound that was never supposed to be touched, a compound on the Black Sea coast, a compound known as one of Vladimir Putin's personal residences, the so-called Putin Palace, the luxurious estate made famous after Alexei Navalny's investigation, had been hit. Not a symbolic strike nearby, not a warning shot, a direct hit, several direct hits. And the world went silent. The Kremlin's reaction tonight was unlike anything seen since the beginning of this war. It was not a routine statement. It was not a symbolic press release. It was urgent and immediate. Russian officials lined up one episode, each calling Ukraine's strike unprecedented and describing it as an act of terrorism against the Russian state. But above everything else, they emphasized one point repeatedly: this was an attack on the personal security of the president of the Russian Federation. And Moscow has long warned that any threat to Putin himself would trigger consequences beyond anything the world has imagined. But threats only matter if the target shows fear, and Ukraine did not show fear. In fact, Ukraine responded today with one of the most bold and fearless messages we have heard from Kyiv since the invasion began. Just hours after the attack was confirmed, President Vladimir Zelensky appeared on camera. He did not deny the strike. He did not soften his language. He did not offer apologies. Instead, he delivered a direct message. Russia brought this war to our homes. Now they understand what that feels like. These were not vague diplomatic words. This was a clear acknowledgement. Ukraine openly signaled that they carried out the strike. They intended to carry out the strike, and they are not afraid of whatever response Russia chooses. And tonight, multiple sources confirmed that Ukraine launched a coordinated drone attack on several locations in southern Russia, including Putin's heavily secured Black Sea residence. That residence had recently undergone major upgrades, believed to be preparations for a lengthy presidential visit planned for next month. Ukraine struck before that visit could happen. They hit the main residence. They hit the outer security zone. They hit the support facilities that were being ready to host Putin and his closest circle. Mandy, in simple terms, Ukraine attacked the core of Putin's personal security network. They struck the infrastructure that guarantees his safety. This is why Western governments reacted so quickly. This was not a symbolic strike meant for headlines. This was a strategic action with the potential to reshape the entire conflict, and Russia understood that completely. Their response tonight included threats not heard in years, not general warnings, not ambiguous statements. They issued a direct and severe declaration. They said Ukraine's leadership, government buildings, and critical infrastructure could face what they called total annihilation. These words, broadcast across Russian state television, were chosen very carefully. They were meant to intimidate. They were meant to shake confidence. And they were meant to signal that Russia sees this attack as a major and dangerous escalation. But the situation becomes even more intense when we consider what Western intelligence believes about Ukraine's motives. Analysts now think Ukraine's strike was not only a military assault, but also a psychological test aimed at measuring Russia's internal pressure after months of battlefield failures and political strain. Ukraine wanted to see whether Putin would react immediately with force or whether he would retreat into aggressive rhetoric. What happened next surprised even Ukrainian planners. Russia did not launch instant retaliation. Instead, they began a series of coordinated steps so organized and so multi-layered that Ukrainian analysts noticed the shift instantly. The Kremlin does not move this way unless it feels directly threatened, and today it absolutely did. Defense experts speaking privately to Western media described Russia's sudden change as a siege mindset, a posture used when a government is tightening control and preparing for something big. At the same time, Ukraine proved that they can strike deeper, more accurately, and more confidently than Moscow expected. Their drones were not only precise, but carefully timed. Russian air defenses failed to intercept even one of them. That single fact reveals something critical. Ukraine is not just reacting to Russia's moves, they are predicting them. They are studying patterns, they are finding weaknesses, and they are executing operations with a level of strategic intelligence that has caught Moscow completely off guard. And as the day progressed, more details began to surface about the scale of Ukraine's operation. Ukrainian special forces carried out reconnaissance missions near the Russian border, forcing Russian units to reposition away from key frontline areas. At the same time, Ukrainian cyber teams disrupted Russian communication networks that had recently been updated. In the Black Sea, Ukrainian naval drones targeted Russian patrol vessels responsible for guarding important coastal facilities. This was far more than a standard drone strike. It was not just a symbolic act. It was a carefully coordinated and strategic move designed to challenge Russia's sense of security at high levels. It represented a refined form of psychological pressure, a field where Russia has faced challenges since the events around Mariupol. And whenever Russia has made progress on the battlefield, Ukraine has responded with actions aimed at weakening Russian confidence, morale, and the perception of strength. Today's strike was a direct continuation of that strategy. Russia once expected the conflict to be short. They believed Kyiv would fall quickly. They believed President Zelensky would leave the country. They assumed Western support would fade after the first winter. They expected Ukraine's military to struggle under continuous attacks. But tonight, those early assumptions no longer reflect the situation on the ground. Gender Ukraine is now striking inside Russian territory, reaching targets that were once considered out of reach. Western assistance remains steady. And Vladimir Putin, who has long projected authority and control, is now facing questions about the security surrounding his leadership. For the first time, people inside Russia are asking a difficult question. If Ukraine can reach a presidential residence, what other locations might be vulnerable? Question carries significant weight within Russia's political landscape. Melanges. What makes this moment even more unpredictable is the pressure Vladimir Putin is facing from within his own system. Military hardliners are calling for a strong and immediate reaction. Economic advisors are urging steps to reduce tensions so that sanctions might ease. Intelligence officials want time to understand how Ukraine managed to breach multiple layers of defense. Political allies want to show stability while avoiding a wider conflict. Putin is trying to balance all of these competing demands while recognizing that Ukraine has demonstrated the ability to strike with precision. Bond. When leaders face situations like this, major decisions are often made under intense pressure. They are influenced by concern, uncertainty, and the need to maintain control. And tonight, it is clear that the Russian leadership is experiencing one of the most challenging moments of this conflict. The official statement from the Kremlin, repeated on state media and shared through diplomatic channels, signaled that Russia views the attack as a direct challenge to structures responsible for the president's safety. Russian officials stated that the strike violates the norms of warfare and represents an act directed at the state. In diplomatic terms, this means Russia considers the strike extremely serious. It is rare for Moscow to speak in such terms unless the situation is viewed as critical. And tonight the Kremlin believes the situation is exactly that. Their concern is not only about positions on the battlefield or territorial control. What is at stake is the security of the Russian leadership, the image of stability, and the ability to maintain authority without interruption. All of these factors were shaken by the Ukrainian operation that unfolded today. Inside Moscow, the impact of the strike was immediate and intense. High-level security alerts were activated across the capital. Elite military units were moved to undisclosed locations. Communication lines that normally remained open were suddenly restricted. Government convoys rushed through the streets as senior officials were transported to emergency command centers. In those first critical minutes, panic spread through the halls of power. No one expected Ukraine to reach this far. No one believed their surveillance systems could be bypassed so easily. And no one inside the Kremlin was prepared for the possibility that the heart of Russia's leadership might be within range. The strike triggered a chain reaction that Moscow has not experienced in decades. Air defense units positioned around the Kremlin launched interceptors in every direction. Fighter jets were scrambled toward the western border. Intelligence agencies activated crisis protocols that are reserved only for major national threats. Russian media was ordered to broadcast a unified narrative, one specifically designed to calm citizens while hiding the scale of the breach. But even with carefully controlled messaging, fear spread quickly across the population. People began sharing videos of explosions and smoke. Rumors circulated that more drones were approaching the capital. And in the outskirts of Moscow, families started leaving their homes, unsure of what would happen next. The most alarming moment came when key advisors entered Putin's private command room with early reports. The information they delivered forced Putin to confront something he never imagined he would hear in his lifetime. Ukrainian drones had passed through multiple layers of Russia's most advanced air defense network. Systems that were tested, upgraded, and strengthened for years had failed within minutes. The strike did not just expose a weakness, it revealed a vulnerability at the core of Russia's national security. This realization hit the Kremlin harder than the explosion itself. It meant that Russia's enemies were no longer at the border. They were no longer limited to the battlefield. They were now capable of reaching into the most sensitive space in the Russian state. It meant that Putin, the man who built his power on the promise of stability and strength, could now be targeted in ways he never prepared for. Inside the command room, voices were raised. Arguments broke out between military officials and intelligence leaders. Some demanded an immediate counterstrike on Ukrainian government buildings. Others warned that such a move could trigger a massive international backlash. Advisors who normally stood united were now divided, each pushing for a different response. Putin listened, but his silence made the atmosphere even more tense. For the first time in many years, he appeared unsure. Across Moscow, the mood was no better. Government employees were ordered to remain inside their offices. Airports were temporarily closed. Security forces patrolled the streets in record numbers. Whispers of fear filled the air. People wondered if this was just the beginning, if Ukraine was preparing more attacks, or if Russia's enemies were planning something even bigger. Analysts on state television tried to reassure the public, but their voices carried a sense of nervousness that was impossible to hide. The Kremlin's biggest concern now was not the physical damage caused by the attack. It was the psychological damage. The strike created a new reality, a reality in which Russia's capital, its leadership, and even its president were no longer untouchable. A reality in which Ukraine had crossed a line that the Kremlin believed would never be crossed. And once that line was breached, everything that followed. As evening fell, new details began to surface about how Ukraine carried out this operation. Intelligence analysts studying the attack pattern realized that the drones did not take a direct route toward Moscow. Instead, they traveled through narrow corridors of airspace that Russia rarely monitored. These routes were selected with extreme precision, indicating that Ukraine had gathered detailed information about Russia's radar blind spots. Even more surprising was the timing. The drones crossed into Russian airspace during a shift change in the air defense network. For a brief window, operators were switching posts, surveillance screens were being recalibrated, and communication systems were momentarily slower. Ukraine used that exact moment to push the drones deeper into Russian territory. This level of timing showed planning that went far beyond a normal strike. It showed an operation built on intelligence, strategy, and deep understanding of Russia's weaknesses. Analysts believe that Ukraine may have also used decoy drones to confuse Russian defenses. Several air defense units fired interceptors at targets that turned out to be nothing more than distraction devices. While Russian forces focused on the decoys, the real attack drones continued toward their objective. It was a classic tactic, but executed with remarkable accuracy. Western officials said that this strike demonstrated a level of coordination they had not seen since the early days of the war. They noted that Ukraine had evolved from reacting to Russian attacks to planning complex, multi-layered operations that challenge Russia's most advanced systems. Some officials even suggested that this attack will force Moscow to rethink its entire air defense strategy, not only around the capital, but across the country. Banned inside Russia, the shock was felt everywhere. Military bloggers who often praise the Kremlin's strength were openly criticizing the failures. Some claimed the air defense network was outdated. Others blamed corruption, saying funds meant for upgrades had been misused. A few even questioned whether Russia was prepared for a modern war at all. These voices, usually loyal to the government, suddenly became louder and more frustrated than ever. For ordinary Russians, the attack created a sense of vulnerability they had never felt before. Many had believed that the war was far away, something happening on foreign soil. But tonight they realized that the conflict had reached their own doorstep. Social media exploded with fear, confusion, and anger. People wanted answers, they wanted reassurance, but for the first time, the Kremlin had none to offer. The biggest concern among security officials now was what Ukraine might do next. If they could strike this deep once, they could do it again. And no one could say with certainty that Russia would be able to stop them. This uncertainty spread through military ranks, political circles, and civilian life. It created a pressure that the Kremlin could not ignore. Tonight, the question haunting Moscow was simple. If Ukraine can reach the capital, what target will they choose next? And how will Russia respond if they can no longer guarantee the safety of their most protected spaces? This question alone was enough to shake the foundation of Russian power. Blind as night deepened, world leaders began issuing statements, each one revealing how seriously the international community viewed the strike. In Washington, officials held emergency discussions with NATO partners. They were not only assessing the damage, but also preparing for the possibility that Russia might retaliate with a force far greater than anything seen in the war so far. Western intelligence agencies warned their governments that Putin, under pressure and facing humiliation, might make decisions that could push the conflict into entirely new territory. But in Europe, the reaction was equally tense. Several nations increased their alert levels. Intelligence services began monitoring Russian military movements with heightened attention. Diplomats across the continent worked late into the night, trying to prepare for any sudden escalation. For months, they had feared the day Ukraine would strike deep inside Russia. Today, that fear became reality, and the consequences were unfolding minute by minute. Meanwhile, in Kyiv, the mood was very different. While officials remained cautious in their public statements, there was a quiet sense of confidence behind closed doors. This operation, whatever its full purpose, had shown the world that Ukraine was capable of penetrating one of the most advanced air defense systems on the planet. It sent a message not only to Russia, but to every nation watching the conflict. Ukraine was no longer simply defending itself. It was showing strength, strategy, and reach. But Ukrainian leaders also understood the risks. They knew Russia's response could be severe. They knew Moscow might target critical infrastructure, government buildings, or even civilian areas in retaliation. Yet they also knew that moments like this define the direction of a war. They had chosen to strike now because hesitation would only strengthen Russia's confidence. By acting boldly, Ukraine forced the Kremlin into a position it did not want to be in. In the hours after the attack, Russian state media began releasing carefully shaped narratives. They claimed the drones were shot down. They claimed there was minimal damage. They claimed everything was under control. But satellite images, leaked reports, and eyewitness accounts told a different story. The strike had hit nerves that propaganda could not hide. Russian citizens were questioning their safety. Military officials were questioning their defenses, and political elites were questioning Putin's leadership. The most unsettling development came when analysts noticed unusual activity near several Russian strategic bases. Aircraft were being fueled. Missiles were being repositioned. Command units were activating protocols normally used during high-risk military operations. No one knew exactly what Russia was preparing for. But it was clear that Moscow was moving towards some kind of response. Tonight, the world is watching closely, waiting to see whether Putin chooses restraint, retaliation, or something far more drastic. What began as a single Ukrainian strike has now become a global moment of uncertainty, a moment that could calm by morning, or ignite into something far more dangerous. And as the hours passed, analysts continued to assess the implications of Ukraine's strike. What is clear is that the operation was strategically timed. It exposed vulnerabilities in Russian air defenses. It humiliated the Kremlin on the global stage. And it demonstrated that Ukraine possesses capabilities that Russia cannot fully counter. Every move made in the next 48 hours could determine the trajectory of the war for months to come. And if Russia responds with proportionate military action, this moment will be remembered as a turning point. If they escalate beyond conventional boundaries, NATO has already made it clear that it is prepared to respond. Ukraine has shown the world tonight that it is ready. It has shown that it is capable. It has shown that it is unafraid. For the first time since the beginning of the invasion, Vladimir Putin appears to be on the defensive. The Kremlin is unusually quiet, too quiet. When Putin is quiet, it means he is calculating. It means he is weighing options carefully. It means he is choosing his next moves with the full knowledge that the world is watching. Because tonight Putin learned a truth he has long known but never fully experienced. He is not untouchable. He is not invincible. He is not completely safe. The Ukrainian strike shattered illusions of absolute control and introduced uncertainty into the heart of the Russian state. This story is far from over, but one thing is certain: Ukraine has changed the rules of this war. Russia has issued threats of annihilation, and the world now stands at the edge of a phase that no one can fully predict. Every decision, every movement, every statement in the coming days will shape the future of this conflict. And the world will be watching, waiting, and holding its breath as the next chapter unfolds.